Tonight, we have Anne Nightingale from Victoria, British Columbia. She's a volunteer and board member with Rocky Point Bird Observatory and loves to share what she's learned about birds and with others. She coordinates the Victoria Christmas Bird Count and hosts Birders Night for the Victoria Natural History Society. She is the recipient of the American Birding Association's Betty Peterson's Award for Conservation and Community. I had the good fortune to meet Anne at a bird observatory conference in Cape May, New Jersey, and I'm very glad I did because now we can connect our coasts. So here's Anne.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, and it's always cool to have somebody else with another bird name around because I know Mary gets the same sort of feedback as I do from people. They remember us though, don't they? Don't they, Mary?
Very much so.
Yeah. So hi, everybody. I am going to bring my screen share up here, and this will just take a second. Any luck at all? So,
oh, okay. And you're going to talk about your interaction. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. And you are seeing my presenter view, right?
We are seeing presenter view.
Right. Perfect. That is what I thought. So that's good. Okay. So this is a little bit of a different kind of talk. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do this presentation. I put it together for you guys. I haven't done it before, but as I was doing it, realizing I wanted to talk about these birds that are similar on both sides of the continent, that I know a whole lot more about the Western birds than I do about the Eastern birds. So there will come opportunities in tonight's presentation for you guys to educate me a little bit on the birds of the East that are kind of similar to some of the birds on the West. So I'm happy to have you unmute your mic when you have something to say. If you want to put your camera on, that's great. But if you don't want to, you don't have to. I can't see you anyway, so it doesn't matter from my end. But this is going to be a bit of an interactive talk tonight, I hope. We are not quite as far as possible away from each other, but we're pretty far away from each other here. You're in Erie, Pennsylvania, and I am all the way across the continent on Vancouver Island, at the south end of Vancouver Island, in the capital city of British Columbia, in Victoria, BC. You can see that you have to come kilometers to get over here, not miles, because I'm doing this from Canada. So it's a little over 4,000 kilometers from where you are to where I am. Things I want you to think about as we go through the talk tonight is, what is a species? And the answer is, we don't really know at the moment, because there seem to be lots of different rules used to determine what's a species and what's not a species. So it's kind of fluid. And at the same time, where we hear people talk about speciation, where different groups of birds, different populations of birds become separate species. But we've got counter examples to just about everything that we say is a species. Like, you'll hear people say, well, species should not be able to interbreed and produce viable young. But yet we see that not only between species, but sometimes between genuses. Like, we've been seeing more and more hybrid rufous hummingbirds and Anna's hummingbirds here in the West. So no one would tell you that a rufous and an Anna's aren't different species, but they can interbreed and produce viable young. So some weirdness going on there that we don't fully understand. Also, as you look at some of the maps that you're going to see, look for signs of range expansion. This is, of course, a real advantage to birds evolutionarily, in that if they can get into more habitats, into more ranges, and expand their range, this is really good for assurance that the population will continue. But with that, maybe that's when you start getting more and more hybridization. So you'll see some very clean maps and some that are not so clean. And also think about the growing pressures on the birds and what might be motivating them to make some of these expansions and changes in their ranges. So a lot of people think that a lot of the speciation was the result of glaciation on the continent. And where there were openings, this allowed birds and animals to get through, to feed and survive. But doing so in very separate areas then caused them to develop traits that were no longer consistent with maybe their ancestor and where species kind of came from. And what we find across North America and sometimes in other parts of the world are that we have kind of mirror image species, almost, maybe is even detectable by human eyes or ears, but they're pretty darn close. So let's have a look at some of these. The rock and purple sandpipers are deemed by some to really not even be able to be told apart in the field, right? You have to work really, really hard to do that. If you look, the rock sandpiper is strictly limited to Alaska and the northern Pacific coast, barely getting down into California as a rarity. The purple sandpiper is all over the East Coast, but they look almost identical. We actually had a purple sandpiper in Victoria a few years ago, and it was, I believe, the second record for British Columbia. But everybody was trying to figure out if they could tell what the difference was. I fully expected to start seeing lots of sandpiper, or sorry, purple sandpiper sightings once people started to look, because you talk about the orange legs, but then you'd find a rock sandpiper that maybe had some orange legs, different characteristics. But it is really interesting that birds that can look so similar be separate species on the opposite coasts. Most birds have more of a hint of a difference. So, for instance, look at the horned puffin and the Atlantic puffin. At first glance, these are really similar birds. But if you look at their bills, you can see a slightly different pattern. They have the same habits. They both like to fish and nesting in burrows. Very, very similar birds, but with just a color difference on their bill is really the thing that really stands out for you. Now, horned puffins are not very common in the Pacific Northwest. They are more common up in Alaska and across to Asia. Is there something about your tufted puffins that is somewhat similar? Like I believe the population is in trouble in the East. Is that correct? Don't be shy.
No, I'm guessing there's a lot of people who don't know much about puffins,
Okay.
since we don't really have puffins here.
Right.
I know that in the past few years, they've seen a crash in their favorite food fish, which I cannot remember the name of, and they are resorting to eating other fish that are not as nutritious for their young specifically.
Right. Yeah, and that's a really good point, because a lot of the changes don't happen with the adults, but really happen with the young, and egg size and productivity all can be affected by things that don't seem obvious at the beginning. Okay, well, I was going to stick with seabirds a little bit. Yeah, I realize that you guys don't have salt water where you are, but there's a few seabirds that are very parallel, and so I do want to point this out. I have never seen a dovekie, but they look. If I was there and saw a dovekie, my first thought would be, well, that looks like a marbled murrelet, right? Very quite similar birds. The marbled murrelet does have a longer neck, and usually you don't see a marbled murrelet. Marbled murrelets seem to travel in pairs. This is winter plumage for them. They look quite different in the summer, and I believe the dovekie doesn't change its plumage dramatically in the summer. But boy, I guess they do. Their whole head goes black, right? Our marbled murrelets actually develop a real brown plumage that looks quite different than their winter plumage. Summer plumage for the pigeon guillemot in the West is amazing, and I see your black guillemot shares a lot of those features. bright, bright red feet and bright red mouth linings. Can you see the little difference between the pigeon guillemot, the western bird, and the black guillemot, the eastern bird? Can you see it?
I can.
Anybody want to hazard a guess what it is? That feather is not out of place in that white patch. It has that little black wedge going up into the wing. And even when they go into their winter plumage and they're basically all gray, you can still see that little wedge in the patch in their wing. This
I was going to say bill size and eye ring.
yeah, yeah, that might be there too, but the really obvious characteristic, and I'm not sure about that eye ring because I think it might just be the lighting on it. The real obvious characteristic is that little wedge, little black wedge up into the wing, and yeah, it's a very different feature. We've had people report black guillemots out here on the West Coast, and they've had horrible pictures. But even with the horrible picture, you can see that little black wedge on the wing, and you can say, no, sorry, that is a pigeon guillemot. This is the sort of match, though, that if you had a pigeon guillemot in amongst a lot of black guillemots at home, or if I had a black guillemot amongst the pigeon guillemots, I don't know if every birder would recognize them. So it's something to remember that there are lookalikes that might be showing up in your neighborhood if you're on the coast, which you're not right now, I know, but if you're on the coast. So look through those flocks. You might just find a rare bird. Okay, we'll go back to land. The common poor will is a bird of the West. You can see by the map there that it just really gets across half the country. And look, the Chuck-Will's willow, a very similar looking nightjar, only in the east. I've often wondered why you get this kind of similarity and birds kind of hit a wall. You know, the Rockies you understand. The Rockies you understand as a barrier. But what is the barrier that keeps these guys apart? I don't know. Anyone there know? The same with the screech owls. You know, they are, you know, their territories really seem to be completely separate, although there obviously are rarities that pop across there. Both these guys, I looked for pictures where they both had their little horns down. And if someone had shown me the eastern screech owl in Victoria, I would have said, oh, that's an unusual red one. We don't get red very often here. But I wouldn't have thought for a second it wasn't a western screech owl. And I suspect the same for our gray bird had it been in the east. But very separate ranges. These maps, by the way, as you can probably tell, are all from eBird. Thank you, Cornell. The Vox's swift of the West Coast is almost identical to the chimney swift and has the same behavior. Vox's swifts, like chimney swifts, will do that amazing swirling display and sleep in chimneys. We don't get a lot of them where I live. And I don't know where you are in Erie, do you get, it looks like on the map here that you probably do get really big crowds of chimney swifts. Is that right?
We have a healthy population.
Yeah, we get them mainly through migration. We don't have really any resident ones. They continue on north. And even on Vancouver Island, we don't see them doing the chimney thing on the southern part of the island. There's like one place about 2.5 hours away. But if you want to see that, you have to go that far, even from where I live, to see it. But it is the same sort of thing as the chimney swift does.
We're actually, I'm sorry, Presque Isle Audubon is currently working towards creating artificial chimney swift towers for the birds.
That's awesome. They're so much fun.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I also did find really interesting as I was putting this together is that if you look at the ranges in the northern part of North America, so the US and Canada, they are quite separate, but check it out. They actually get together down in The southern part in the Central America part, or the connection between North and South America, they get there together. And so this makes me wonder about wonder I wonder if they ever trade, right? Kind of like twins, where some of the boxes swifts may show up with the chimney swift, and some of the chimney swifts may actually show up with boxes, and we don't even notice. The peewees, again, quite a similar bird. They don't sound the same. You guys have a better peewee sound than we do. Ours is more just a peer sound of one note, one down slurring note. So I much prefer the Eastern wood peewee's song. But we see this quite regularly. This is almost the same map as the previous one, where it really is the center of the country that seems to be causing the divide amongst the species, but overwintering in the same areas. I remember us getting, not this particular bird, but a fellow member of the species here in Victoria, and the hours that were spent trying to determine whether it was an ash-throated or whether it was a great crested, or even a brown crested for that matter. Lots of conversation about how similar these birds were, but still have their own separate ranges. Although the ash-throated does look like it's starting to get into the east a little bit, especially along the coast. And they seem to maintain them quite a bit. I know that Audubon has published a really interesting interactive website where you can increase climate change, increase the temperature, and see what the ranges of the birds are going to do. So we know that these external events do have an effect on the birds. And in some cases, they end up doing a little better than they were. And in many cases, they end up not doing as well as they were. But you can start to see some movement here. Like, what is it that would prevent an ash-throated flycatcher from going east? It looks like not so much. But the great crested does not appear to have come west nearly as much. Okay, you might say I'm cheating here because female hummingbirds, for the most part, do kind of look alike. But these are two of the same genus, the black-chinned hummingbird in the west and the ruby-throated in the east. In the province that I live in, British Columbia, we are fortunate enough to have 5 species of hummingbirds. Anna's hummingbirds are most common. Rufous hummingbirds, the next most common. And then we have black-chinned, calliope, and the very occasional ruby-throated in the northern part of the province, because the province extends east from the Rockies just a little bit. So the ruby-throateds are still on the other side of the Rockies, but the little upper corner of British Columbia does get them. So we can lay claim to 5 hummingbird species. Would it be flexing if I asked you guys how many hummingbirds you guys get on a regular basis? I know the ruby-throated one is your key hummingbird, right?
That's just about it. But rufous in the fall is starting to become more common.
Yes, and there's been some really interesting band recoveries. In fact, one of the birds that we banded near here was caught in Virginia. So that little bird traveled all the way across the continent to help put a little dot on your eBird list for a rufous hummingbird. Now, you'll notice a red line down this page. And the reason I've done that is because in the time that I've been a birder, and I was a late bloomer, there have been a number of splits. These used to be the same bird. Anybody remember what they were? What they were called, say, 25 years ago?
Spectacled?
Solitary vireo.
Solitary. No. Yeah. Okay.
But they split them and made one blue-headed and made one Cassins. So they were so similar that people thought they were a single species, but they changed it and now they are 2, and with quite distinct ranges, except that the Cassins vireo range just snuggles right in to the blue-headed vireo range.
Well, I have a
Mary,
question. I have a question.
sure.
To me, they look identical. How did they decide they're two separate birds?
I think if you look really closely, you will see a slight difference in the bill. They even, I believe, sound fairly similar. Um, but these days, a lot of the splits are being determined by genetics. So they're doing DNA analysis and determining that there are sufficient differences in the DNA, which, I'm going to say honestly puzzles me a little bit. If we're only 1% different than chimpanzees, how different could these guys be? Right? So, but finding particular genetic markers that make them determine that they are separate species. I find it particularly confusing when you can see that their ranges come so close together. There are some, like when we look at the next one up, where the ranges are quite distinct and they don't interact very much. But here, you would think that there ought to be some kind of hybridization line right around the areas where both of those ranges meet. How about these guys? That's a really bad picture of a winter wren, but that's the one I wanted to share with you because it's mine. Because when I became a birder, all of these little guys, troglodytes, were winter wrens. And then something happened. In 2009, 2010, they determined that they weren't all the same. In fact, there were three. It was a three-way split where the Eurasian one, which had also been, well, they usually just called it wren, but where they had been considered conspecific, that they were no longer considered conspecific. The Pacific wren is the one that you'll find on the Pacific coast and inland just a little bit from there. The winter wren name stayed with the eastern version of it. There's a gap in the middle of the continent where there are none of these guys. And then the Eurasian wren got, I believe maybe it's European wren. They split it into three. No, it is Eurasian wren. They split it into three instead of one, again, based primarily on genetics, but also on behavior. Because the winter wren, yours, does a lot of migrating, whereas the Pacific is in its range throughout the year. So this isn't a species that all of the ones from the north go to the south and then come back in the spring. Some of them will stay year round throughout the entire range. They are best differentiated by sound first, but then once you've got the sound, you will notice that the winter wren has a paler chin than the Pacific wren does. And there are some other color differences between them, but boy, they act the same, they look the same. And to a new birder, I would say they even sound the same. If you're a very experienced birder, you might pick up the differences, but I don't think most novice birders would. So it was really good that someone who knew what they were doing found them. Pygmy nuthatch in the west is matched really closely to my eyes by the brown-headed nuthatch in the southeast. Both of them are adorable. What's wrong? There's nothing wrong with a nuthatch, is there? They're very sweet birds. So pygmy nuthatches are also in the south. Both of these nuthatches tend more towards the south, although they are starting to get up into the interior of British Columbia, which of course is an area that has warmed up quite a bit through climate changes. Okay, I know, not fair. Ampids, they all look the same anyway, right? So, but I did like to just compare how, again, not even these lookalike ampids seem to cross that barrier in a lot of cases. So Hammond's flycatchers that have a call sometimes that can be easily mistaken for least flycatchers, and Acadian flycatchers are pretty similar looking ampids, but occur on opposite sides of the country. They both have a little bit of an eye ring, but not as bold as, say, the Pacific slope, but not supposed to be in each other's territory. I wonder how many get missed by birders and possibly even banders alike because they're not expecting to see the other one in their neighborhood. One of my favorite birds is the Buick's wren, and I love him so much because he has such a great song repertoire. Buick's wrens have about 200 different songs. And as I'm teaching people how to recognize Buick's wren song, I have to keep telling them that you have to really try and focus on the voice rather than the tune, because the tune changes up so frequently. In fact, if the tune changes up really frequently while you're listening to it, you really have pretty good odds that you're listening to a Buick's wren. Song sparrows can do the same thing, but they don't do it nearly as often. In fact, I have threatened and probably will follow through with my bird friends in this area that one of my next presentations that I'm going to do for them is simply going to be called "It's a Buick's Wren." It was when people are learning their song and they send me sound files. It's kind of a running joke that I just will answer Buick's wren anyway. When I was learning bird song and I was out with my birding mentor, I would say, "What's that bird?" And he would say, "It's a Buick's wren." And then I'd hear something completely different. I'd say, "What's that?" And he'd go, "Buick's wren." And this, would go on like this for hours. And at one point, I eventually accused him. I said, "I think when you don't know what it is, that you just say it's a Buick's wren." Well, it turns out that actually that is a really good strategy here. If you hear a song that you don't know, you've probably got a better than 50-50 chance that it is going to be a Buick's wren. Carolina wrens are really focused in the south, it looks to me, by these eBird maps. There are some differences here, right? Like this is overall a much warmer brown and a buffy belly on it, but structurally it's really identical to the Buick's wren. And sometimes I even hear Buick's wren singing Carolina wren songs, and so I wonder just how close they might really be. Does the Carolina wren sing a lot of different songs, or does it really stick with the one main song?
We don't have a ton here. They're just starting to move into our area. Most of the ones that we do here are the typical tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle.
Right. Yeah. So if you look at the Buick's wren here too, it is also expanding into your area. So it's going to be really interesting if these birds do get together and make little Buick Carolina wrens. And what they'll do if this becomes a very popular pastime of these guys. And of course, western and eastern meadowlarks were also considered conspecific for many years, but have been split. But notice the map here. The western meadowlark actually is in the east as well. And so it's not a nice clean break like you get with some of the other pairs. This one is kind of mucky. I don't envy the people that have to try and figure these out in the middle of the range here. So do you have some tips? Because I think you get both of them in your area, according to this map.
No, we rarely see a western meadowlark here.
Okay.
I mean, the eBird map obviously shows some reports, but well, let's put it this way. I don't know if anybody's looking for them.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe something to keep an eye out for and see if you can figure out the subtle differences. The difference is primarily in their song, but these guys are mimics. At least the western is. We have a western meadowlark in my neighborhood, not too far away, that can sing a perfect red-winged blackbird song. And several people have made the trek specifically to go and videotape it. Well, I guess it's not videotape anymore. Video it to show that it is in fact the western meadowlark singing the red-winged blackbird song. Eastern and western bluebirds are very similar and are a problem for beginning birders to look at them and figure out the difference. The main difference seems to be in the color of the throat. The red goes all the way up into the throat for the eastern bluebird, but not for the western. Now, in some species, a subtle difference like that would not be considered a whole separate species, but rather two subspecies of the same species. So again, it will be interesting over time to see if any of these birds end up getting lumped. We recently had northwestern crow lumped in with American crow, much to the chagrin of people that live on the West Coast. I see that in the recommendations or the proposals this year, the AOS is to give us our northwestern crow back. Are these birds two separate species? They certainly are in 2022. Who knows whether they will be down the road. The Townsend's warbler is one of our most attractive warblers. And here's where you guys get to flex. We only have, in the area that I live, 8 regularly occurring warbler species. Makes identifying warblers really easy. They don't even look like each other. Whereas you guys have quite a few, like what, triple that many? 4 times that many? And in the fall in particular, your warblers undergo quite a dramatic change and make them very difficult to tell apart. We don't have that same problem here. The Townsend's warbler, though, has, again, a very variable song. And at the north end of Vancouver Island, there are a lot of little islands. Someone a few years ago was actually studying the different dialects and found that the songs varied, even just not very far apart, right? Where these small islands were, the Townsend's warblers would have a slightly different song than the fellow just at the next island, which is pretty interesting. This is another pair that will hybridize, and I don't know how viable their young are, but then throw hermit warbler in there as well. The Townsends will also hybridize with hermit warbler. So are we really looking at 3 separate species here, or is there one super species that includes all 3 of those? Another split that has happened in my lifetime, well, certainly in my lifetime, almost in my birding lifetime, I think it started just before I became a birder, was the split of the eastern towhee and the spotted towhee. There used to be the rufous-sided towhee, and they both are rufous-sided. The spotted towhee has more spots than the eastern towhee, but the eastern towhee still has a few white feathers in it. So again, very similar birds that the people that make those decisions decided that they weren't the same species. And again, quite a bit of overlap in their range. So it really does make me wonder how many intergrades you might end up having in that overlap range. Bullock's orioles and Baltimore oriole. Now here's a pair that don't even look all that close, but they were all Baltimore orioles not all that long ago, and they pulled the bullocks out of that. Looking at them, you can see why. There certainly are some visual differences. The range also doesn't overlap much, but it does overlap. So again, very interesting that you can have birds that look very different that were considered a single species, whereas you can have birds that look very much the same that actually end up being a couple of species, or 3 sometimes. Now I'm going to move into something that's a little bit different. Birds that are actually much more different looking, but they fill the same niches and same as a different range. Do you guys know this story? Can you see what we've got going on in this nest here? There are 2 birds visible in this nest. This is an eagle's nest, bald eagle nest. The bird on the left is not a bald eagle. A few years ago, this is not far from my house, but a 15-minute drive from my house, a bald eagle pair with 3 youngsters raided a red-tailed hawk's nest and brought 2 babies to the nest to feed them to their young, which is what happened with one of the babies. But the one on the left here, nicknamed Sparky, just opened his mouth and started begging, and the eagles started feeding him. And despite the fact that there were 3 much bigger eaglets in that nest, Sparky grew and thrived and fledged before the eagles did. So 2 different raptors raised in the same nest. We did think that was a little bit odd, and also that we wondered what Sparky would do when he had to go and fend for himself for food, because he may be one of the few red-tailed hawks that was practically strictly raised on fish. Okay, so getting on to these 2 birds, no one would mistake these 2 for being the same species. This is a black oyster catcher on the left with an American oyster catcher on the right. You can see the range difference, although a little bit of overlap in Baja California. Again, quite distinct ranges. One of the other proposals in this year's AOS briefing is that the black oyster catcher should become a subspecies of blackish oyster catcher, which is the South American version of the oyster catcher, which is quite different. Again, you kind of wonder how these are both kingbirds, right? They don't look alike at all. So here we have the western kingbird and the eastern kingbird, but look at their ranges. The western kingbird is clearly expanding to the east, and the eastern kingbird is clearly expanding to the west. So they are not birds with separate ranges, overlapping ranges, very different looking birds, but do the same behavior in the same kind of habitat. So are an interesting pair. How about our jays? We have a blue jay in town. We have lots of Steller's jays in town that a lot of people call blue jays. You know, to a birder, this blue jay is a blue jay, or to a non-birder. To a birder, obviously, the difference is quite striking. Again, we're seeing some expansion, particularly the blue jay moving east or moving west, and we are seeing more and more blue jays on the west coast now than we ever did before. Buntings are interesting birds. Leisurely bunting is really limited to the west with a little bit of smattering in the east, but the indigo bunting, like the others that we just looked at, definitely seems to be moving west. I had a call a couple of years ago now from someone who told me that they had an interesting looking junco in their yard, and I asked them to describe it, and they said, well, it's a blue junco. And I'm going, there is no such thing as a blue junco. What could it possibly be? And so, I said, well, what, are we talking like sort of a blue gray, like a slatey colored? And he said, no, not at all. He says it's blue, like a bluebird, blue. So I persuaded him to let birders come and have a look, because it was the first indigo bunting I think that we'd had in the Victoria area in about 30 years. But it was the second one that we'd had on the island within about 3 years. So we are seeing more of them in the west. I know you guys are dying for the California condor to move east, right? We also would like to see some black vultures over here, please. Perhaps we can arrange a transfer. That might work out well. The black vulture on the right here actually was spotted on Vancouver Island at the very north end of the island by a lighthouse keeper. The black vulture came and sat outside his house, and that was pretty fantastic, right? First record for British Columbia, I believe, at the time. And then it disappeared, but showed up about a week later at the southern end of the island. Everybody was very excited about it, very, very excited, until I got a phone call or a text in the middle of the night saying, "You do know the story behind the black vulture, don't you?" Which I apparently didn't. But by the time that I had unraveled the story, it turned out that a raptor center in the South Island area had acquired 3 of these black vultures from Georgia, from a rehab center that said these birds will never fly. Apparently that wasn't true, because a tree fell on their enclosure and this one got out and did fly, and caused quite the ruckus on Vancouver Island until that little tidbit of information got shared. Probably explained why it was a little friendlier with the lightkeeper than you might have expected a wild black vulture to do. We also have some east and west sound alikes. And I just brought a few of them. Oh, someone has something attacking their window right now. What is that? A blue jay? So the sound alikes are birds that look similar or not, but have very similar sounds. So let's see if this will work for us. So the McGilvery's warbler has these little eye arcs, so you're never going to mistake it for a mourning warbler if you see it. But I find the sound is really quite similar. In fact, I was in Nova Scotia and I thought I heard what sounded like a McGilvery's warbler with a little bit of a twist. And when I checked, it sounded to me like a mourning warbler call that I had in my Sibley's. They didn't accept my record of it, even though the only other thing it could have been was a McGilvery's warbler, and that would have even been rarer than the mourning warbler. But let's have a listen. This is McGilvery's. Okay, so that's McGilvery's warbler. That one sounded closer to McGilvery's. And of course, they do have variable songs. And I found those to be quite similar. And actually, when I asked someone who was an expert about what I heard and described it as sounding like an interesting McGilvery's, a slightly off McGilvery's, they also said, "Oh, you must have had then a mourning warbler." That's what they sound like. The Western and Scarlet Tanagers are also quite similar sounding, at least to my ear. And this one does have an interesting story with it as well. At one of our map stations some years ago, someone was there as a volunteer at our station and made a comment about a rose-breasted grosbeak in the tree right ahead above us. Very casual comment about that. Well, the rose-breasted grosbeak is a very unusual bird for us, and we just assumed she'd come from the east and actually meant black-headed grosbeak and didn't think a thing of it. The following week, we actually caught a rose-breasted grosbeak, and we were all excited about it. And she said, "Well, I don't know what you're so excited about. I told you last week there was one in the tree right over you." And so she hadn't been mistaken. It was a rose-breasted grosbeak. And as you can see by the map, they are expanding into the west quite considerably. And turn them off. Okay, so who knows what's going to happen next, right? What the future for species is. In 2010, David Sibley suggested what he thought would be the next 10 North American bird splits, and a lot of them were on geographic lines. So he thought the eastern and western willet would be split, the whippoorwill, eastern and Mexican, and I'm not sure about that, whether that one has or not, but Pacific wren and winter wren did happen, as did the merlet, but that's a northern southern split. You could see that he was right on a few of them, but not on all of them, that's for sure. And in fact, the red crossbills did get split with the cassia crossbill, but they're now looking at that, looking at revoking that. I think if I click on this, it will bring up this year's proposals. And can you, I'm thinking you can't see that, is that correct? Or do
That
you
is
see-
correct. We can only see the link.
Okay, hang on, my cat just decided to type. He's learned that typing gets my attention very quickly. I'm just going to reshare that one. Okay, now can you see?
Yes.
Okay, so you can see that we have a lot of recommendations to split birds. We have reinstate northwestern crow. We're hardly bitter about that. And then several thrushes that they're looking to try and separate them. Really interesting complex of saying to lump one and separate another. Lots and lots. I'm not going to read all of these for you, but you'll see that a lot more suggestions about splitting. And this is something that is expected to increase as DNA analysis becomes more common. Because if you determine that a DNA difference might be the best judge of whether you have separate species, you can expect that a lot of these look-alike birds are going to be separated in the not too distant future. So I'm going back to this one. Nope. Okay, so some potential splits include things like the fox sparrow. These are still the same species across the continent, but look how different they appear. This on the left is our west coast sooty fox sparrow, and you've got this nice rufous red fox sparrow in the east that we see occasionally, but not very often. The juncos, the same. We have a dark-eyed Oregon junco, and you guys have the slate-colored junco in the east. You know, should they be considered the same species? There's a big complex of juncos under the dark-eyed junco group. Will DNA analysis show that they are the same species or different? And even the song sparrow, lots of range here. I've joked with a lot of people over the years, the western song sparrow, the one you see on the left there, looks overall a lot grayer, a lot dingier than the eastern song sparrow. And in fact, it's true with a number of our birds that have a lot of white in them, like the downy woodpecker, for instance. And I used to joke with people and say it's because it rains so much here that they all just kind of get moldy, and that turns them gray. But there's actually a weather related real reason for this. As I'm sure many of you know, white feathers are not nearly as hardy as darker feathers. And so when you do have a very damp climate, you know, water can be very hard on bird feathers. And so to have a little bit of melanin in them makes them considerably stronger and helps them tolerate the wetter winters that we might have here. Okay, when I started this talk, this was the slide that I showed on my cover. And notice it has birds down the west and the east coast. So did anybody figure out what species this was? Again, you guys are not on the ocean, so that may put you at a little bit of a disadvantage here. But this is common myrrh that splits east and west. And with that, I'll just say thank you, everybody. And I hope you had fun learning a few new things about the birds. I know I did in putting the talk together.